Greetings and welcome back to the Dr. J Vlog series. It is Wednesday, March 25th, 2026, and we're doing a vlog for the first time in the series on the purpose and meaning of life, first time in a little while. And I've been giving this a lot of thought and been doing some writing, and I thought I'd start to share some of my ideas. And they're not original ideas. I'm always building upon the work of others. But I thought I'd address the question of what happens when we die. And so this is going to be part one of 2 or 3 vlogs. I'm not sure how many yet. Depends on how much I think I have to say that might be interesting, that might be worthwhile, etc. We all have to confront the issue of death in our lives. Every culture has beliefs about death, often, but not always rooted in spiritual or religious faith traditions of some kind. So, for example, as many of you probably already know, Christianity teaches that death's not the end, but rather a transition to eternal life. I'm oversimplifying, obviously, but most Christians believe in the resurrection of the body and the soul's journey to enter into either heaven or hell based on one's faith and relationship with God. There's a tendency to create comforting memorial spaces to honor our loved ones who have passed, and hopefully we like to celebrate, or at least believe the thought that we're going to have some type of heavenly reunion down the road. And similarly in Islam, death marks the beginning of the soul's journey to the afterlife. Right? The Islamic tradition teaches that after death, souls enter barzakh, an intermediate state, if you will, before the day of judgment. And on that day, Allah will judge each person's deeds, determining whether they enter Jannah, paradise, or Jahannam, which would be the Christian equivalence of hell. And that's also why Muslims bury their dead rather than cremate them. That is in the belief that there will be a physical resurrection on the day of judgment. The dead are buried facing Mecca, and graves are raised above the ground that are marked by stones, that sort of thing, so that nobody walks on them. Jewish beliefs about the afterlife are a little bit more complex. They've evolved over the millennia. They vary a great deal depending upon different traditions and so on. But traditional Judaism speaks of Olam Haba, the world to come. Through Jewish theology, they tend to focus actually more on the righteousness of the living entity, the living being, and what we do here in this world, as opposed to focusing too much on what comes next. Jewish mourning traditions, including sitting Shiva and reciting the Kaddish prayer, these provide a structured way for families to honor the deceased, their loved ones, and to take comfort in the community of support that may surround them. Hinduism offers a very different perspective on death through the concept of reincarnation. According to Hindu philosophy, the soul, or Atman, is eternal and undergoes the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, or samsara, until it achieves moksha, which is the liberation from the cycle. So the quality of one's next life is determined by karma, the accumulated consequences of actions in previous lives. And thus their belief system encourages ethical living and spiritual development as pathways to this eventual liberation. And Buddhism shares with Hinduism the concept of rebirth, but differs in some key ways. Buddhism teaches there's no permanent soul. Instead, consciousness continues through rebirth until one achieves nirvana, the cessation of suffering in the cycle of rebirth. And Buddhist funeral practices often include meditation, chanting, and offerings to help guide the deceased's consciousness toward a favorable rebirth and ultimate enlightenment. And then, of course, there are, beyond these traditions, and there are many other faith traditions as well, but there are also certainly many indigenous cultures around the world that maintain their own distinct traditions and beliefs regarding death and the afterlife. And these often, though not always, again, it varies tremendously, but they'll often include beliefs about ancestral spirits, the spirits which will continue to influence and guide the living, or from which they'll seek guidance. And so there's a whole complex array of potential relationships involving the living and the dead, rather than just one fixed set of practices or beliefs. And so, I guess more generally, depending upon where you're born in this world, what you're exposed to, obviously, you're going to have your own personal beliefs then about death, what happens, and what, you know, once we're done here, what's going to happen next. And all of that's going to vary tremendously. But there's one universal aspect, I think, in all of this too. That is that every tradition recognizes that there's something else, what that something else is exactly, but who knows, but there's something else beyond the natural life of human beings, or even if they can't prove that, say with the scientific method. In fact, of course, without the scientific method, there are some, such as atheists, for example, who believe that death simply marks the end of our conscious existence. In the extreme, then, nothing comes next. All that remains essentially would be whatever the contributions we made while we're here as the living, and whatever they might remember, whatever it might come in the, it could come in the form of one's offspring, through the interactions and the influences that one has in our daily lives upon others, or other types of cultural contributions, say, in the form, for example, of written words or paintings or music, whatever we might have created. It could be the structures that we built, etc. So, what could we all agree on then with respect to death? Is there anything that's truly universal about our understandings of death and even the afterlife? And from a scientific perspective, believe it or not, I think there actually is. And I don't mean we're ever going to get 100% agreement, right? But here's what I do think, or I've been thinking about a lot lately, and it's based upon the writings and teachings of others who've thought about these issues and thought about death more from, if you will, the perspective of the universe as a whole, or typically, rooted in our current or our common understandings these days of the basics of physics and naturalism and science, and how all of this helps us to understand the universe as a whole. Okay? Now, again, I don't mean that there's 100% consensus on all of these issues either, but I think it helps us move in a direction towards consensus at the very least. So in that is, again, if we look at death from the perspective of the universe, and in that sense, death really doesn't exist, at least in the ways that we humans typically think about death. So in terms of our material existence, at the very least, it can't stop existing completely because the roughly 7 octillion atoms that comprise your body, that's 7 times 10 to the 27th, these atoms, even after you die, they continue to exist. They were there billions of years before you came into being, and they'll still be here long after you've left. Okay? And so basically what we call death is just a rearrangement, kind of a reorganization or change in the pattern of our existence. Each of us represents, at this moment and at any given moment, a contemporary configuration of things that are essentially eternal. I think at some level, nearly all of us appreciate that, and perhaps even would be willing to accept that as a foundational truth of human existence. Okay? I'd simply then ask the following questions, to which you can respond yes or no. Do you believe that you're comprised of much smaller entities, such as atoms, that are coordinated and arranged in such a way as to produce you as a person, or at least as a physical, living, breathing entity? Yes or no? Probably yes. Do you believe that your existence in this form is actually temporary and ultimately will end, whether you call that ending death or something else? Yes or no? And do you believe that the atoms or the basic elements of your physical body continue to exist, albeit perhaps in different forms after your current life ends? Yes or no? I think if you answer yes to all 3 questions, we're already very much on the same page. And answering yes to these 3 questions, by the way, in no way is meant to diminish or challenge any other frameworks or beliefs about death or life after death. I'm simply establishing a premise that I think 99.99% of us could agree upon, at least in terms of the physics of the human body as an entity in our shared universe. And death in this view is not the opposite of life, but rather it's a part of life. As Carl Sagan has suggested, death is the mechanism by which the universe recycles, regenerates, and continues the grand experiment of complexity and consciousness, end quote. And of course, the universe doesn't lose anything, kind of like the first law of thermodynamics, which states that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. So when we die, we're still part of the universe, but we're going to be transformed. And that's the way it's always been in the grander sense of our existence. There's simply an eternal dance of energy and matter that, through a variety of processes that we actually understand quite well, produces the unique configurations that we call you and me and the sun and the planets and everything else that exists. In fact, well, what I might even suggest further or ask further would be, can you point to anything in the universe that lasts forever in its current configuration? Meaning at the level of some combination of atoms. Individual atoms like hydrogen atoms, for example, with a single proton and a single electron, are said to be indefinitely stable and should essentially last as long as the universe does, however long that might be. And I'm going to leave that aside simply to argue that there's no configuration of anything comprised of multiple atoms that can last forever. A universal principle in that sense seems to be the permanence of impermanence. And if we accept that premise, then a lot of stuff sort of falls into place, and it's much easier to think about our own universal existence as including rather than excluding death. It's also, at least in my view, a much more comforting way to think about eternity. But again, you might disagree. But at least by my understanding of the physics of the universe and the processes of entropy, after some unknown trillions of years, the supply of energy that's needed for stellar formation will dissipate. All existing stars will eventually stop shining, and the universe will gradually grow darker and colder, and will reach ultimately a state of maximum entropy. Now, regardless of whether that's the correct model or not, the point here is to suggest that physical matter and the atoms that form each of us should be around for an unfathomably long time. And when I think of trillions of years, or even simply the estimated 13.8 billion years since the Big Bang, I feel like that's an eternity. There's no reference point that allows me to really think about this too differently, right? I mean, if I tried to count to 1 billion, 1 second at a time, nonstop, it would take me 31.7 years to do that. And if I wanted to count to 1 trillion, that would take me over 31,688 years. And so here we are, right? We are, each of us, a unique configuration of some 7 octillion atoms. And what makes us unique then would be precisely the unique arrangement of these atoms, the information that's encoded in the atoms and how they relate to one another in order or through the fields with which that extend far beyond our current comprehension and deep understanding. And again, just as important, these atoms were forged in the 13.8 billion years that have elapsed since the Big Bang. And some of these atoms, of course, were forged in the nuclear furnaces of massive stars that have lived and died long before any of us were born, of course. Others were the byproducts of the supernovae that were so powerful and so bright as to outshine entire galaxies. And somehow, through a complex array of processes, some of these atoms ended up assembling into our own sun and our solar system, eventually, of course, our planet, and then reassembled further to create, or in the forms of biological life that we've observed here on Earth over the last several millennia, millions of years actually. And then eventually into the animals with central nervous systems, and then ultimately you and I. And here's the thing, all of these atoms that comprise you and I and everything else predated our very existence. and already existed in other entities and configurations in the universe, such as in the other stars, the other solar systems in different forms, right? And then ultimately, as I said, in the ferns, the bacteria that were in the primordial oceans of our own planet, and the oxygen and the carbon dioxide that sustain life. And then ultimately, they became part of our very selves, our very being, our existence in this form. And yet there's one other fascinating aspect to all of this too. We ourselves are in a constant state of change, losing tens of billions of cells each day, each, of course, which also contain roughly 100 trillion atoms. Sure, we feel the same day after day, mostly. We feel like we're these stable entities with names and addresses and so much more. We don't really feel the changes that often because it's so gradual. But we do know we're changing. We know at the very least we're aging. We're all aging. And I like to think we're not dying, but rather that we're forever in a state of permanent and gradual change. When we die biologically, the atoms, of course, don't die with us. They just get returned to the pool to become part of something else. The universe wastes and loses nothing. It just reassembles into new patterns, at least for the foreseeable future. It's ashes to ashes and dust to dust, which we all heard about or read about at some point. But that's still something. It's not nothing. Nothing truly ends in that sense, but rather simply transforms. As Sagan has commented, death is not a wall at the edge of existence. It's a doorway to the next configuration, the next pattern, the next temporary arrangement of eternal atoms. I quite like that. And so that's why, if you really think about it, you're not a thing that exists as a fixed entity or a noun. You're more of a verb. You're in a process you're in a state of continual change, a state of continual becoming, if you will. Or as Richard Feynman likes to say, or used to say, you are not the stuff, in other words, the matter, you are the pattern. And so the best way to conceptualize our existence in this sense is the old river analogy that the Buddhists particularly quite like. So we look at the river, right? We can go down to the river, like the one that's in my very backyard, and it's there every day. Then we can describe the shape and the appearance and the color of the water, etc., and so much more. But we name the river. In fact, the one behind me is called the Thames here in London, Ontario. But the water's constantly flowing and changing. The water in that river today is completely different from the water that flowed through yesterday, and it's ever thus. So the river itself, of course, changes every single moment. It's in a state of perpetual flux and flow. And you and I are very much like that river, in a perpetual state of flux and flow and change, however gradual. And again, even if you didn't notice, every few years, in fact, you're a completely new pile of stuff, at least in terms of your cells and the very atoms that comprise those cells. And death then represents the transition phase in life when you see that pattern stop dancing, or when you as a river stop flowing. So we are each an open system that requires incredible amounts of energy to remain in an ordered configuration that allows us to function, to maintain a certain body temperature, to keep all our parts in working order, etc. And it's a lifelong, literally a lifelong struggle to keep ourselves together, to maintain the pattern that constitutes ourselves, whoever we are. The second law of thermodynamics describes what we're fighting against, and that is, of course, entropy and disorder, which I've talked about before. That is the tendencies for everything to sort of jiggle apart rather than stay together. I've said before, everything falls apart in time. And thus, when we do eventually die, at least from a physical standpoint, the pattern that was us essentially falls apart. The energy's released. The atoms stop following the DNA's instructions that they've been provided. And all of your atoms and energy then return to the vast chaotic universe from which they came. I find that incredibly comforting. Perhaps you don't, but I'm just giving you my perspective. just like the proverbial wave crashing on the shore. It's here one moment, but gone the next. And yet the water remains. It flows back into the ocean from whence it came. And we, all of us, then flow back into the ocean of the universe from where we came. My late mother, I think, must have believed this too at some level. She asked when she was much younger, years before she eventually passed, she said she didn't want to just hang on indefinitely, especially she didn't want to be a burden to the family. That's what she was talking about. And so she, sort of half jokingly, she would say, you know, if I get to that stage where I can't look after myself and I am a burden, just put me on a raft and shove me away from the shore out into the ocean. Well, she's there now, having returned to the ocean of the universe, back on February 26, 2024, just over 2 years ago. But she's not gone, certainly not from our memories, from all the people that she affected when she was here. And she hasn't left the universe either, certainly not at the atomic level. She just changed her form. And so I'm going to end the discussion here today, but it's just the first part of trying to answer this eternal question then of what happens when we die. So I hope you'll check in again for part 2, perhaps as early as this weekend. We'll see. But regardless, as ever, in the meantime, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives, nurture love in your hearts, and dole out hugs in abundance. Peace.